Mark stepped out of his car, adjusting his tie after a long, exhausting day at the office. The autumn air was crisp, leaves crunching underfoot as he approached his front door, feeling the usual comfort of coming home. But something felt off. A strange tension seemed to permeate the walls, lingering like a faint smell he couldn't quite place. He unlocked the door quietly, a habit he'd developed after years of trying not to wake Laura if she was napping or the kids if they'd already gone to bed. As he entered, he heard her voice, a light, playful tone he hadn't heard in years. It carried down the hallway, punctuated by giggles that sounded far too familiar. His brows knit in confusion. Standing in the foyer, he debated whether to make his presence known. He assumed Laura was on the phone with a friend. He hadn't heard her laugh like that in so long. Curious, he took a few silent steps forward and froze when he heard another voice. A man's, deep and murmuring, almost inaudible. Mark's heart clenched. He felt his pulse quicken, a strange foreboding creeping over him. Taking another step, he could hear more of the conversation. "So, when can we meet again?" The man's voice was low, filled with a warmth that made Mark's stomach churn. He'd never heard anyone talk to his wife like that before. "I don't know," Laura's voice replied, hesitant but excited. "Mark's been distracted lately, so I've had more time to myself. But we have to be careful." The word careful echoed in Mark's head like a siren, loud and relentless. He was now fully alert, every nerve ending tingling as he strained to hear more. "You've been stuck with him for so long, Laura," the man said, his tone smooth, calculated. "You deserve to be happy. With someone who actually sees you." Her laugh was soft but vulnerable, the kind that used to be reserved just for Mark. He barely recognized the sound now. Mark's heart began to race, pounding in his chest with an intensity that made his hands shake. Everything in him wanted to burst into the room and confront them both, but he couldn't move. A part of him still clung to disbelief, a stubborn refusal to accept what his senses were telling him. "I just wish it were easier," Laura said with a sigh. "I wish he weren't so oblivious, you know? Then I wouldn't feel so guilty." The man's voice softened, luring her further into whatever dark fantasy they were building. "Laura, you deserve this. You've been neglected for so long. Don't you want to feel alive again?" Mark's stomach twisted. He'd seen Laura distracted lately, but he'd assumed it was stress, work, or even just the passing strain that happens in a long marriage. Never this. "Besides," the man added, "it's not like he's made much of an effort lately. You're practically living like strangers." Laura's voice was barely a whisper. "I know. Sometimes it feels like I'm not even there. Just someone in his life he has to deal with." Mark's heart shattered. Was this how she saw him? He hadn't thought of their marriage as perfect, but he'd believed they had a solid foundation. And now, the ground was crumbling under him. He took a deep breath, willing his body to calm down. He wanted to make sure he wasn't mistaken, that this wasn't some horribly misconstrued situation. But then Laura spoke again. "When can I see you next?" she asked, her voice soft, vulnerable, and completely unlike the Laura he thought he knew. "Tomorrow night," the man replied, confidence dripping from his tone. "Just say you're going out for a work event. He won't question it." At that moment, something snapped within Mark. His hands clenched into fists as he fought the urge to scream. He had to get out of there before he did something he'd regret. Without a sound, he backed out of the hallway and exited the house, closing the door with the quietest click he could manage. Outside, he sucked in the crisp night air, but it did nothing to soothe the storm brewing inside him. He stood on the lawn, staring at the house that had once been his sanctuary, feeling like an outsider in his own life. Every memory, every moment they had shared now felt tainted. He thought of their kids, the life they'd built, and he felt an overwhelming urge to preserve it, to protect them from this twisted reality. The next day, Mark couldn't focus at work. His mind replayed every word he'd overheard, dissecting it, searching for some clue, some way to make sense of it all. He considered confronting Laura but hesitated, uncertain what would follow once that Pandora's box was opened. Later that night, he stayed in the shadows as she prepared to head out for work, her lies flowing effortlessly. She didn't even look him in the eye as she made her excuses. He watched her leave, feeling both devastated and disgusted. Unable to bear the silence of the empty house, he went into their room and opened her closet. He ran his hand over her clothes, feeling each piece as though trying to understand the woman she had become. In the back, buried under a pile of scarves, he found a small box he'd never seen before. Inside were receipts, hotel bills, restaurant checks, little notes scribbled with a man's name, Derek. It was real. Every piece of evidence screamed it. Laura was having an affair. Mark put the box back, his hands trembling. He felt like he was on the verge of breaking, but he forced himself to hold on, knowing he would have to confront her. When she returned that night, Mark was waiting in the living room. Laura's eyes widened when she saw him there, his expression a mix of sorrow and cold fury. "Had a good night?" he asked, voice low, dripping with bitterness. She froze, her face paling as she realized he knew. Silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. Mark's heart pounded as he waited in his car, parked just down the street from Derek's place. It was a quiet suburban neighborhood, where each house sat perfectly spaced from the next, the street lined with manicured hedges and pristine driveways. He gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white, fury boiling inside him. He had been tracking Derek's schedule all week, knowing tonight was the night Laura planned to meet him. Earlier that day, he'd found one last message on Laura's phone. She had left it unlocked by mistake. She told Derek she'd sneak out after dinner. Those words, playful and full of promise, twisted inside Mark's chest, filling him with a rage he had never known before. He drove here in a storm of emotion, watching as Derek's lights flickered on, then off, knowing that any minute his wife would arrive. When he saw Laura's car pull into Derek's driveway, his blood roared in his ears. She stepped out, her face glowing with a smile that used to be just for him. She looked around nervously, then rushed to Derek's front door, slipping inside without a second glance. Mark's pulse quickened. He climbed out of his car, moving silently, his anger controlled but potent. Every step brought him closer to a confrontation he knew was inevitable. As he approached Derek's front door, the details of his surroundings burned into his mind. The slight creak of the porch step, the faint scent of pine from the nearby trees. He could hear muffled laughter inside, and it stoked the fire of his anger until it felt almost unbearable. A plan formed in his mind, raw and simple. He'd wait them out. He'd see this man face to face, make him understand what it meant to cross into another man's life so deeply and selfishly. Hours passed, every minute dragging as he waited in the shadows. Around midnight, the door finally opened, and Derek emerged alone, looking as relaxed as any man might after an evening spent with someone else's wife. He closed the door behind him, oblivious to Mark's presence just a few feet away in the shadows. Mark held his breath, waiting, his body tense as a coil. When Derek reached the end of the porch steps, Mark stepped forward, blocking his path. Derek stopped, his face contorting with confusion. What are you doing here?" he stammered, trying to step back, but Mark advanced, his face dark and unreadable. "You know exactly who I am," Mark's voice was low, dripping with venom. "And you know exactly why I'm here." Before Derek could respond, Mark's fist connected with his jaw in a brutal swing that sent Derek staggering backward. He barely had time to recover before Mark's fist struck him again, this time driving into his stomach, forcing the air out of his lungs in a harsh gasp. "What do you think you're doing?" Derek gasped, trying to shield himself as Mark's fists continued to land, each one fueled by the weeks of betrayal, humiliation, and anger that had been festering inside him. Mark didn't stop. He couldn't stop. All he could see was the image of Laura sneaking into this man's house, her laughter, her whispers. He drove his fist into Derek's face, hearing a sickening crack as blood began to pour from his nose. "You thought you could steal my wife? My life?" Mark snarled, his voice low and deadly as he struck Derek again, throwing him to the ground. Derek tried to crawl away, but Mark grabbed him by the collar, dragging him back, his voice shaking with fury. "Did you think I wouldn't find out? Did you think you could just take everything from me?" Derek tried to speak, his voice weak, pleading. "Look, I didn't mean to." "Shut up," Mark roared, silencing him with another blow. Derek's head snapped back, his eyes dazed as he fell onto his back, gasping for air. Mark felt his own breath come fast and heavy, his entire body alive with adrenaline, his fists clenched as he looked down at the man lying helplessly before him. In that moment, he felt no mercy, only a fierce, primal satisfaction in seeing his rival broken, bloodied. Every detail burned into Mark's mind. The way Derek's face had twisted in terror, the fear in his eyes as he realized he was utterly helpless. Mark took a step back, his heart still racing, feeling a strange clarity in the silence that followed. Derek lay on the cold concrete of his doorstep, his face bruised, his body motionless. Mark realized he had crossed a line, one he could never uncross. The anger in his chest began to cool, replaced by a cold, sinking feeling. He looked down at his bloodied hands, the reality of what he'd done sinking in. A faint movement caught his eye as the front door creaked open. Mark's heart dropped as he saw Laura, standing there, her face pale as she looked from Derek's unconscious form to her husband, her eyes wide with horror. Blue and red lights flashed against the side of Derek's house, illuminating the tidy shrubs and well-manicured lawn in a garish glow. Mark sat on the curb, hands clasped together, his shirt stained with Derek's blood. Laura stood nearby, arms wrapped around herself, her face pale as she watched the police officers swarm the scene. Mark felt a twinge of satisfaction knowing that Derek was being loaded into an ambulance, unconscious and bloodied. But his own satisfaction was quickly tempered by the sight of the two detectives approaching him, their expressions serious and suspicious. Detective Price, a tall man with a stiff jaw and a look of perpetual disapproval, led the way. He wore a neatly pressed suit, and every movement radiated authority. Behind him trailed Detective Alvarez, a wiry woman with sharp eyes that darted around, noting every detail as if capturing the entire scene with a glance. "Mark, is it?" Price's voice was laced with contempt as he stared down at him. "Mind telling me what happened here?" Mark glanced up, meeting Price's eyes with a smug, challenging look. "What happened?" "You know, that's a great question," he said, his tone thick with sarcasm. "But I was about to ask the same thing. How do you guys usually spend your time in a neighborhood this quiet? Must be thrilling." Price's mouth twitched in irritation. "Let's keep the attitude to a minimum, shall we?" "Attitude?" Mark scoffed, crossing his arms. "Detective, I'm just a man enjoying the fresh night air. It's not a crime to sit on the curb, last I checked." Alvarez shot Price a look as if urging him to ignore the bait, but Price took a step forward, leaning down slightly. "I'm not here for games, Mark. Your wife called us, and we've got a man on a stretcher, barely conscious. Witnesses said they saw you lurking around this neighborhood for hours. So why don't you start explaining?" Mark rolled his eyes, his voice dripping with disdain. "Witnesses, huh? Guess Neighborhood Watch is pretty strong around here. But since you're so eager for a story, here's one. I got a call from my wife." He nodded toward Laura, who was still watching in silence. "She sounded panicked, said there was someone harassing her at Derek's place. So I came here to help." Price's expression remained skeptical, though he let Mark's words sink in. "You came here to help? By beating a man into unconsciousness?" Mark raised his hands in mock innocence. "Look, maybe the guy tripped and hit his head. Or maybe he had a pre-existing condition. I can't control the guy's health, can I?" Price's patience wore thin. "Let's try this again. You're saying you didn't touch Derek? You didn't lay a hand on him?" "Wow," Mark smirked, his tone dripping with mock admiration. "You've got it all figured out, detective. You're right, it's a total mystery. Maybe aliens came down and decided to rough him up. You're welcome to write that in your report." Detective Alvarez took a step forward, her eyes narrowing. "Mark, we're giving you a chance to tell us what happened. Keep up this act, and things could go a lot worse for you." Mark let out a short, humorless laugh. "Worse? Look around, detective. My wife's been having an affair with this parasite." He spat the word, gesturing vaguely toward Derek's house. "What do you expect from me? Flowers and a thank you card?" Alvarez exchanged a glance with Price, her voice taking on a cooler tone. "So you admit you were angry? Enough to follow him around and help him get a few bruises?" Mark shrugged nonchalantly. "Maybe I was angry, detective. But last time I checked, anger isn't a crime. And anyway," he sneered, What's a few bruises when you're stealing another man's wife? Laura, who had been silent this whole time, finally spoke up. Mark, stop, she whispered, her voice trembling. Just tell them the truth. You followed Derek here and waited for him. Mark shot her a cold glare, ignoring her plea, his tone unyielding. Detectives, if you want to know why I was here, it's simple. I came to talk to him, to give him a piece of my mind. That's it. I didn't lay a finger on him. Price raised an eyebrow. Funny how giving a piece of your mind ended with Derek lying unconscious on the ground. Mark scoffed, his tone sarcastic and dismissive. Guess he couldn't handle a little constructive criticism. Not my fault if he has a glass jaw. Detective Price shook his head, his patience hanging by a thread. You think this is funny? That guy might not wake up anytime soon, and you're here, making jokes? Oh, you're right, detective. It's a real tragedy, Mark deadpanned, the sarcasm in his voice sharp enough to cut glass. A heart-wrenching story. I can't imagine what the world will do without him. Alvarez took out her notepad, ignoring Mark's attitude as she scribbled notes. So, Mark, if you didn't assault him, how do you explain the blood on your shirt? Because it sure doesn't look like yours. Mark glanced down at his blood-stained shirt, the crimson patches still wet. I already told you. I showed up, saw him lying there, probably from a nasty fall, and tried to help. You guys should be thanking me for attempting first aid. Price stepped closer, his gaze ice-cold. Mark, enough with the games. We both know there's more to this than you're letting on. And if you keep stonewalling us, you're only going to dig yourself a deeper hole. Mark's eyes flared with a dangerous gleam. Go ahead, detective. Dig away. You think I care about your threats? Do your worst. I'll even wait right here. At that moment, another police officer approached, motioning Price aside to speak quietly. Mark watched them, his arms crossed defiantly, a smirk still playing on his lips. He could tell they didn't have enough to arrest him outright, and that knowledge gave him a twisted sense of satisfaction. When Price returned, his expression was unreadable. Mark, we're taking you in for questioning. You can tell us the truth, or you can keep up this attitude, but either way, we're going to get to the bottom of this. Mark's smirk grew wider, almost taunting. Sure, detective. By all means, let's go. I'll gladly tell you the same thing I've been saying all along. As they led him toward the squad car, Laura looked at him, her face a mixture of fear and sorrow. He met her gaze, but his eyes were cold, hardened by betrayal. For a brief second, he almost felt the weight of everything he'd done, and what it had cost him. But he shook it off, his face returning to the mask of defiance he had worn all night. As he got into the car, Price leaned down, giving him one last steely look. You may think you're clever, Mark, but you'll slip up. They always do. Mark shrugged, a smug grin on his face. Keep dreaming, detective. I'm not going anywhere. Mark sat in his kitchen, still feeling the adrenaline from his recent run-in with the police and Laura's affair. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a grayish light through the window, bathing the room in a cold, harsh glow. He hadn't slept, and every nerve felt raw and exposed. After everything that had happened, the shock, the betrayal, and the night's violent confrontation, Mark was left with only one goal: complete destruction of the man who had ruined his life. After a few clicks on his computer, Mark found what he was looking for: Julia Harper, Derek's wife. Her social media profiles painted a picture of a happy life. Snapshots of family trips, her smiling with Derek, a couple of photos of their 2 young children. But now, Mark knew it was all a lie. He hesitated before pressing the call button, aware that by reaching out to her, he would detonate a bomb in another life. But his anger outweighed any lingering sense of guilt. He dialed her number, his heart pounding as he listened to it ring. Hello, a soft, slightly hesitant voice answered. Julia Harper? He asked, keeping his voice calm and measured. Yes, this is Julia. Who's calling? There was a note of politeness, but it was strained, as if she was wary of an unknown number. This is Mark Hudson, he said, pausing to gauge her reaction. I think you know my wife, Laura. Julia was silent for a beat, then her voice hardened. I know Laura. Why are you calling me, Mr. Hudson? He took a deep breath, deciding to rip off the bandage quickly. Because your husband, Derek, and my wife are having an affair. I thought you deserved to know the truth. The silence on the other end was deafening. Mark waited, hearing nothing but the soft, uneven sound of her breathing. Finally, Julia spoke, her voice trembling. Are you sure? Mark's voice was steady as he replied, I caught them, Julia. I confronted Derek last night. He didn't even try to deny it. Her breath hitched, and there was a faint sound, as though she were choking back a sob. Mark waited, giving her the time he knew she needed. He was familiar with that initial shock, the way the betrayal cut into you, raw and unfiltered. I thought it was just my imagination, Julia whispered. I thought maybe he was working late or that he was just, I don't know, distant. She paused, her voice thickening with anger. How long has this been going on? I don't know exactly, Mark replied, his voice tight. But it doesn't really matter, does it? They both lied to us, betrayed us, and carried on like we were nothing. Julia let out a bitter laugh, her voice gaining strength. You know what's funny? He used to complain about people who cheated. Said he could never understand how someone could do that to the person they loved. Turns out he was a hypocrite the whole time. Mark felt a surge of dark satisfaction hearing the venom in her voice. He wasn't alone in his rage, his bitterness. Laura was the same way, he replied. Always talking about loyalty and trust, about being a team. Turns out her idea of team was just making sure I didn't catch on to what she was really doing. God, they're disgusting, Julia spat, her words dripping with contempt. All those little lies, the sneaking around. I feel like a fool. Mark leaned back, his own anger mirrored in her words. They didn't just lie to us. They lied to everyone. I keep thinking of all the family dinners, the holidays. They stood there, pretending like everything was fine, like nothing was wrong. And we believed them. Julia's voice grew colder, hardened by realization. And the worst part is, they probably enjoyed it. The thrill of sneaking around, the excitement. While we sat at home, worrying, trying to make things work. Mark nodded, though she couldn't see him. It's sick. I keep replaying it all in my head, wondering how I could have missed the signs. But I trusted her. Trusted that she'd be honest with me. I never thought. His voice trailed off, the rawness of it catching him off guard. Julia took a shaky breath. Same here. Derek always made me feel like I was the problem. I kept thinking it was my fault, that maybe I wasn't good enough. And now I see he just wanted an excuse to run off with someone else. The silence between them was heavy, but Mark felt a strange comfort in it, knowing he wasn't alone. They both sat with the shared pain, the anger simmering under the surface. Finally, Julia broke the silence, her voice icy and filled with determination. You know, I thought about confronting him. Part of me still wants to scream at him, make him see what he's done. But I don't even think he'd care. They wouldn't care, Mark agreed bitterly. It's all about them. Their happiness, their excitement. They're probably already planning their next rendezvous, completely unfazed by what they've done. Julia laughed, a cold, hollow sound. Isn't that the truth? Derek's probably lying in a hospital bed right now, cursing his luck for getting caught, not regretting what he did. Laura probably thinks I'm the villain now, Mark added. I'm sure she's telling herself that she deserves to be happy, that I just don't understand her. It's sickening. The line went quiet as they both let the bitterness settle, each lost in their thoughts. But then Julia's voice broke through, soft and determined. We can't let them get away with this, Mark. They need to know what it feels like. They need to understand the pain they've caused. Mark felt a chill run down his spine at the intensity in her voice. He knew that he wanted revenge, had felt it boiling inside him since the moment he discovered the affair. But hearing Julia voice it, hearing the steel in her words, gave him a strange sense of purpose. I agree, he replied, his voice low and steady. They've taken everything from us. Maybe it's time they know what it feels like. A plan began to form in his mind, vague but powerful, fueled by the shared betrayal and pain that connected him to this stranger. Julia's voice softened, and for the first time, he heard a note of gratitude. Thank you, Mark. For telling me. For not letting me live in ignorance. I think I needed to hear it from someone else. Mark nodded, swallowing down the ache in his throat. We deserve better, Julia. They may have betrayed us, but we don't have to let them keep that power. We can take it back. As they ended the call, Mark felt a renewed sense of clarity. He wasn't sure what would come next or how they would each seek their revenge. But he knew one thing for certain. Derek and Laura's betrayal would not go unpunished. 14 months had crawled by since that explosive night outside Derek's house, and Mark could hardly believe it was finally over. The courthouse was an imposing building, all gray concrete and heavy doors, but today it felt like a sanctuary. As he stepped outside, papers in hand, the final decree of divorce finalized and stamped, he took a deep, liberating breath. He was finally free from Laura, and from the endless, suffocating burden her betrayal had left him with. Mark looked around at the courthouse steps, watching the other people milling about. Most were locked in tense conversations or fighting back tears, a stark reminder of how much pain and loss echoed through the walls of that building. But for him, there was only relief. Relief and the faintest flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time, hope. He had been through hell over the past year. The drawn-out divorce proceedings had been brutal, with Laura fighting for every shred of their old life, refusing to let go. At first, she denied everything, refusing to admit to her affair. But Mark's evidence, the call logs, the receipts, and Derek's eventual reluctant testimony under oath, had sealed her fate. What still haunted him, though, was the revelation that Laura was pregnant. He remembered the gut-wrenching moment in court when Laura's lawyer had brought up her condition, trying to use it as leverage for a better settlement, implying the child could be his. But the paternity test put that to rest. The child, the one she was now raising alone, was Derek's. Mark had known the child wasn't his before any test. Something inside him had known the night he caught them together. But hearing it confirmed in that sterile courtroom, with Laura looking down and avoiding his gaze, had put the final nail in the coffin. He had lost his wife, but not to death, to betrayal, to her choice. And he didn't have to mourn that kind of loss anymore. He walked down the courthouse steps, tucking the divorce papers into his briefcase. It was a symbolic moment, the closing of a chapter, and he wanted to savor it. No more marriage to Laura. No more obligations to a woman who had destroyed their life together. And no responsibility for a child born from that destruction. As he reached the bottom of the steps, his phone buzzed. It was Julia. She had been a surprising ally in the aftermath of the affair, a friend who understood the full extent of his anger and pain. They had both gone through hell because of the people they trusted most, and they'd found a strange solace in their shared anger and grief. She had finalized her own divorce 6 months ago, and since then, they had met up periodically to commiserate, and occasionally to laugh over how their exes' lives were falling apart. He answered the call, a smile tugging at his lips. Hey, it's official. I'm a free man. On the other end, Julia let out a relieved sigh. Finally. How does it feel? Mark chuckled, a dark humor in his voice. Like I've been released from prison. I can't believe it took this long, but I'm glad it's done. I can't even imagine, Julia replied, sympathy clear in her voice. Derek's still dragging things out with me over child support and visitation rights. He's acting like he's the victim. Can you believe that? Sounds about right. Mark shook his head, remembering Derek's pathetic attempts to shift the blame, to make himself seem like the misunderstood party. These two, they deserve each other. Let them ruin each other's lives. Julia laughed, but there was a bitterness in her voice. Funny, isn't it? We spent years giving them everything, and they threw it all away for, what, exactly? The thrill of sneaking around? Mark's expression darkened. They got what they wanted. And now they're stuck with each other. They shared a moment of silence, both absorbing the irony of it all. Julia finally broke the quiet. So, what's next for you, Mark? Now that you're free? Mark considered the question, feeling a strange sense of weightlessness. For the first time in years, he had no responsibilities binding him, no obligation to a family that had betrayed him. I don't know yet. But whatever it is, it'll be something for me this time. I spent too many years putting everyone else first. I get it, Julia replied. You've earned it. Thanks, Julia. And hey, Thank you for everything. You were the one person who really understood what I was going through. She hesitated, her voice softening. It goes both ways, Mark. You were there for me too. Without you, I might have let Derek get away with everything. They hung up, and Mark took a long, steadying breath. He walked toward his car, feeling the weight of everything he'd been through finally lift. His life was his own again, and he was ready to build something new. As he drove home, memories of the past year drifted through his mind. Moments of anger, sadness, frustration, and ultimately, determination. The divorce had been bitter and dragged out, Laura refusing to let go without a fight. She had tried everything to get more than she deserved, demanding the house, spousal support, even trying to guilt him into co-parenting Derek's child. But Mark had stood his ground, refusing to let her manipulate him any longer. The legal battles, the nights he'd spent alone, wondering if he'd ever feel peace again, all of it had led to this moment of finality. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Rebuilding his life after so much destruction would take time, but he was ready. Pulling into his driveway, he saw the house in a new light. It was no longer a reminder of a broken marriage, but a blank slate, a place where he could finally begin again. The divorce decree felt like a badge of survival, proof that he had endured and emerged stronger. Mark stepped into his home and closed the door behind him, shutting out the echoes of the past. The silence was no longer oppressive, it was peaceful. The future stretched ahead, uncertain but filled with possibility. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, raising it in a silent toast to his newfound freedom. The bitterness of betrayal was still there, but it no longer consumed him. Instead, there was a faint flicker of something brighter, a sense of purpose, a knowledge that he had survived the worst and come out the other side. To freedom, he murmured, the words sounding strange but wonderful. He took a sip, savoring the taste, letting it mark the beginning of his new life.